The wind howled across the jagged mountain ridges, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter and the faint smell of pine smoke from distant camps hidden somewhere in the valleys below. A boy of no more than 14 trudged along the rocky path with his bare feet cracked and raw against the frozen earth. His clothes were nothing more than scraps sewn together from rags he had found in villages where people chased him away, and his thin arms trembled against the cold. His name was Elias, though hardly anyone remembered it, for to the world he was simply a homeless boy, an orphan who had no family, no fire to sit by, and no door to call his own. Every day he wandered between villages, begging for scraps of bread or sleeping beneath the open sky while stars pierced his dreams like silent watchers. Yet despite the harshness of his life, Elias carried a spirit unbroken by misery. Somewhere deep within, he still believed that kindness had a place in the world, and that belief kept him moving even when hunger twisted his stomach and frost gnawed at his bones. On one such bitter evening, as shadows stretched long and the mountains blazed crimson under the setting sun, Elias stumbled across a sound that froze him in his tracks. It was a weak cry, high and trembling, echoing from behind a cluster of boulders that lined the path. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling strangely, but then he heard it again, clear and desperate. Cautiously, he crept closer, his heart thundering in his chest, and there, huddled against the stone, he saw her, a native girl, perhaps a year younger than him, wrapped in tattered deerskin, her face pale from exhaustion, her ankle swollen and bound with a strip of cloth. She looked up at him with eyes dark as midnight, filled with pain and mistrust, and Elias knew instantly that she had been struggling to cross the mountains alone and had fallen. The boy swallowed hard, for he understood danger. Villagers often spoke with fear and hatred of the native tribes that roamed the wilderness, and he had seen how quickly suspicion could turn to violence. If anyone saw him helping her, they might beat him or worse. Yet something in her eyes, something vulnerable and pleading, burned away his hesitation. Without a word, Elias knelt beside her, pulled off his ragged scarf, and draped it gently around her shoulders. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I won't hurt you. I'll help you get across." She stared at him for a long moment, as though measuring his soul, and then with the faintest nod she allowed him to lift her arm over his shoulder. The journey across the mountains that night became a test of his very will. Snow began to fall in soft sheets, blinding and silent, covering the rocks and paths so completely that Elias could barely see where he placed his feet. The girl leaned heavily against him, her breaths ragged and shallow, and several times he nearly slipped as her weight dragged him off balance. Still, he pressed on, whispering encouragements, telling her stories of how he once dreamed of finding a family, of building a fire in a cabin where no one could turn him away. She listened in silence, but every now and then her grip on his shoulder tightened, as though those fragile words gave her strength to keep moving. Hours passed, and Elias felt his body growing numb, his legs burning with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. He remembered nights of lying hungry beneath the stars, nights when no one came to offer a hand, and he swore he would not abandon this girl to the same fate. When her ankle throbbed so much she cried out in pain, he crouched and let her climb onto his back, carrying her piggyback despite his thin frame. His breath came in clouds, his heart hammered against his ribs, but he carried her until finally, through the swirling snow, they glimpsed the faint glow of torches down in the valley beyond the ridge. The girl whispered something in her own tongue, too soft for Elias to understand, but the gratitude in her tone needed no translation. Carefully, he helped her down near the edge of the forest, where the wind softened and the ground leveled. She looked at him with tears shining in her eyes, then reached into a small pouch tied at her waist and pressed a carved pendant of bone into his hand. Elias stared at it, confused, but before he could speak, she smiled faintly and whispered, "Tomorrow," before disappearing into the trees with surprising swiftness despite her injured foot. Elias stood there for a long time, clutching the pendant, wondering if he had imagined the entire encounter. When he finally staggered down into the small abandoned barn he often used for shelter, he collapsed on the straw, utterly drained but strangely at peace. For the first time in many years, he felt as though his existence had mattered, that in this vast, cold world, he had managed to bring light to someone else's darkness. But as dawn broke over the mountains the next day, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Elias awoke to a sound unlike any he had ever heard before. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his body, and the air filled with the pounding rhythm of hooves. Rushing to the doorway of the barn, he froze in astonishment and fear. Across the frost-tipped meadow, 30 native warriors on horseback approached in a formation as precise and powerful as a storm sweeping across the land. Their faces were painted with the colors of war, their spears and bows gleaming in the morning light, and their eyes locked onto him with intensity that made his knees weak. At their center rode the girl he had helped, sitting tall and proud now, her foot bound properly, her deerskin cloak repaired, her gaze fierce yet gentle when it met his. She raised her hand, and at once the thunder of hooves ceased. The 30 warriors stood still, their horses snorting mist into the cold air, their silent presence filling the meadow with an unshakable weight. Elias clutched the bone pendant in his hand, his breath caught in his throat, his heart racing with both terror and wonder. Why had they come? Was this his punishment for interfering? Or had that single act of kindness opened a door to something far greater than he could ever imagine? The boy who had once been invisible to the world now stood at the center of its gaze, the lives of 30 warriors resting their attention upon him, and the path ahead would change his destiny forever. And so ends the beginning of our story, but what awaits Elias when these warriors reveal why they have come? Will his courage be enough to face the truth that kindness can awaken forces beyond imagination? To find out, stay with us for the next chapter. And dear friends, if you want more powerful and emotional stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because every story here is made with heart, courage, and the hope of inspiring you. Elias stood frozen in the doorway of the barn, the pendant clutched so tightly in his hand that its edges pressed into his skin, but he hardly noticed the sting, for the sight before him was overwhelming. 30 warriors on horseback, fierce and unmoving, their eyes locked on him as though weighing the worth of his very soul. The girl he had carried across the mountain the night before lifted her chin, and in a voice that rang with both authority and gentleness she spoke words in her own language that Elias could not understand, but the way the warriors' heads inclined toward her told him that she was someone of importance, perhaps even the daughter of a leader. She gestured toward him then, and to his astonishment, the warriors lowered their weapons and dismounted with movements so fluid and disciplined it felt as though the earth itself bent to their will. Elias's chest tightened with fear. Would they punish him for touching one of their own, for daring to carry her across the mountains? But then the girl stepped forward, her cloak swaying in the cold morning air, and when she reached him she did something that stole his breath. She knelt slightly, placing her hand on his chest where his heart beat like a frantic drum, and whispered in halting English, "You saved me. You are not forgotten." Her words, though broken, carried a weight that struck deeper than any blow, and when she turned back to her people, lifting the bone pendant high so that all could see, the warriors let out a cry, a sound both fierce and reverent, that echoed through the valley like thunder. Before Elias could comprehend what was happening, one of the warriors, broad-shouldered and stern, stepped forward and motioned for him to follow. His instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, for he was just a homeless boy with nothing but scars of survival to his name, yet something stronger than fear tugged at him, the memory of the girl's fragile weight against his back, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was not the end but a beginning. So he followed them, his bare feet crunching against the frost as they led him from the barn across the meadow and into the forest where trails wound like veins between towering pines. The horses moved with silent power beside him, the warriors speaking softly in their own tongue, and Elias realized with awe that he was walking in the heart of a people most villagers only spoke of in whispers. Hours passed, the forest deepening, until at last they emerged into a wide clearing where smoke curled from fires and rows of lodges stood like guardians around the central space. Children darted between the lodges, women tended to pots simmering with rich scents, and everywhere eyes turned toward him, curious and cautious but not cruel. The girl led him to a lodge larger than the rest, its entrance marked by carved poles painted with symbols he could not read. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the smell of sage, and seated upon a blanket woven with intricate patterns was a man whose presence filled the space like the very mountains themselves. His hair was long and streaked with gray, his eyes sharp as hawks, and though age lined his face, his posture radiated strength. The warriors bowed slightly to him, and Elias understood, this was their chief. The girl stepped forward, speaking rapidly in her tongue, her voice trembling at times as she recounted her story. Elias could not grasp the words, but he felt the weight of her emotion, saw how she gestured toward him, how the pendant glimmered in her hand. When she finished, the chief turned his gaze on Elias, a gaze so piercing it felt as if it might strip away every layer of his being. Then, to Elias's astonishment, the chief spoke in deep, measured English, words rough but clear. My daughter tells me you carried her when she could not walk, that you gave her warmth when the cold wished her dead. Few outside our people would risk such a thing. Why? Elias's throat tightened, and for a moment he could not speak. How could he explain the emptiness of nights spent alone, the pain of rejection, the hunger that gnawed his belly, the way kindness had become his only weapon against a world that saw him as nothing? At last he whispered, because no one ever helped me. I know what it is to be left behind, to be forgotten. I couldn't do that to her. His voice cracked on the last words, shame burning his cheeks, but the chief did not look at him with disdain. Instead, silence fell, thick and unyielding, until the man finally inclined his head ever so slightly. A heart that knows suffering is a heart that carries strength. You may think you are nothing, but to us, today, you are something. He motioned, and one of the warriors placed a blanket around Elias's shoulders, soft and warm, its woven patterns unlike anything he had ever seen. The gesture brought tears to his eyes, for it was the first time in his memory that someone had given him comfort without expecting anything in return. In the days that followed, Elias remained among the tribe, slowly learning their ways. They showed him how to kindle a fire that would last the night, how to read the tracks of deer in the snow, how to listen to the whisper of rivers to know where fish would gather. Children who at first kept their distance began to laugh and play around him, and though he stumbled through their language, they taught him words with patience. Yet always there was the girl, her ankle healing steadily, her presence never far from his side. She told him her name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, and she laughed when he struggled to pronounce it but encouraged him gently until he spoke it properly. In her company, Elias felt something he had never known before, belonging. But as peace settled in his heart, shadows also lingered. Rumors spread of conflict, of settlers pushing deeper into the land, building, claiming, driving tribes away. One evening, Elias overheard warriors speaking in hushed voices, their tone heavy with worry, and though he understood little, he caught the words, war, and danger. Fear prickled his skin. He had wandered enough villages to know the cruelty of men who saw themselves as conquerors, and he realized that the kindness he had been shown might soon be tested in blood. That night, as he sat by the fire with Ayana, he confessed his fear that he would bring trouble to her people, that perhaps his presence would be seen as betrayal if outsiders discovered he lived among them. She looked at him with steady eyes and shook her head. You did not bring trouble, Elias. Trouble was already here, but maybe you bring hope. Her words, spoken softly yet with unshakable conviction, stirred something deep within him, a flame that banished his doubt. The next morning, the chief summoned him once more. The warriors gathered, 30 strong, the same who had stood before his barn, and their faces were grim but resolute. The chief explained that scouts had seen settlers approaching with guns and wagons, clearing forests and hunting game without thought, threatening to drive the tribe from their land. They do not know you are one of us now, the chief said, but you know their ways, their tongue. You know their hearts of greed and fear. You can walk where we cannot. Elias felt the weight of his words pressing down like the mountains themselves. He was still just a boy, homeless, forgotten, but now he carried the trust of 30 warriors, of a chief, of Ayana. Could he bear such a responsibility? His hands shook, but then he remembered. The night on the mountain, remembered how he had carried Ayana when his body had screamed to give up. If he could do that, then perhaps he could do this too. So he agreed, not out of pride, but out of the same reason he had lifted the girl on his back, because no one else could, and he refused to let others fall into the darkness he had known. With guidance from the tribe, Elias set out on paths toward the settlers' camp, a necklace of bone and beads around his neck, a token from Ayana to give him strength. The journey tested him again, hunger gnawing, fear whispering, but he pressed on. When he finally reached the edge of the settlers' territory, he saw men with axes felling trees, their laughter hard and careless, rifles leaning against logs, wagons drawn by weary horses. He approached cautiously, his heart thundering, and when they noticed him, they mocked his ragged clothes, asking what a beggar boy was doing alone in the wild. But Elias, summoning courage he never knew he possessed, spoke with a voice steady and clear. He told them of the mountains, of the people who lived there, of how war would bring death not just to one side but to all, and though they sneered at him at first, some eyes shifted uneasily, doubt flickering. He spoke not with threats but with truth, with the raw honesty of a boy who had known suffering and yet chosen kindness. His words lingered like seeds in the wind. Whether they would listen or not, Elias could not know, but when he returned to the tribe, the chief clasped his shoulder and said, "You have done more than most men would dare." And in that moment, Elias understood, he was no longer the invisible boy wandering alone. He had become a bridge between worlds, fragile yet vital, and though his journey was only beginning, he had found something greater than shelter, greater than food. He had found family, purpose, and a place where his name was spoken with respect. The story of the homeless boy who once had nothing but rags would live on, whispered by fires and carried on the wind, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could summon warriors, shape destinies, and awaken hope in a world that desperately needed it. And dear friends, if this story touched your heart, if you believe like Elias that kindness still matters, then please subscribe to our channel, because here every story carries the power to inspire, to heal, and to remind us that even the forgotten can become unforgettable.